Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're going to drift through something surprisingly human, something oddly comforting, and something that connects us all across time: what people used before toilet paper. From moss in medieval Europe, to corn cobs in early America, to bamboo tools in ancient China, you're about to discover just how creative humanity has been in the most private moments of daily life. If you enjoy these kinds of videos, long, peaceful dives into forgotten corners of history, go ahead and subscribe so you can fall asleep to new ones. And before you drift off completely, leave a comment down below and let me know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now, where you are. I'd love to know how far and wide this sleepy little community has reached. Now take a deep breath, get cozy, and let's begin. Let's begin our journey in the heart of the ancient world, a city that pulsated with the hum of daily life: marble colonnades, clinking goblets of wine, the chatter of senators in white togas, and rather curiously, a very peculiar approach to bathroom habits. Imagine waking up in the city of Seven Hills sometime around 70 AD. The sun filters through linen curtains. Outside, vendors are already shouting in the forum, and a baker down the alley is stoking the morning fire. You slip on your tunic and sandals, splash a bit of cold water on your face from a bronze basin, and make your way through narrow stone streets, headed to the nearest latrina publica, a public restroom. Yes, in Rome it was common, even expected, to relieve yourself among others. These weren't the cramped, fluorescent-lit cubicles we know today. Public toilets were often open-air structures, sometimes roofed, sometimes not, with long stone benches lined with holes evenly spaced. Beneath them ran channels of continuously flowing water that carried waste away, a clever early sanitation system connected to Rome's complex aqueducts. You take a seat on one of the benches. There's no door, no stall. On your left, a merchant leans back, humming. On your right, a soldier scrolls through a piece of papyrus, perhaps a letter from home. Everyone's just going about their business, quite literally. Now comes the interesting part. No rolls of paper here. Instead, Romans used something called a tessorium. Picture a sponge, natural, soft, porous, tied to the end of a long wooden stick. After using the toilet, this sponge on a stick was dipped into a bucket of water, often mixed with vinegar or salt, to sanitize it. It was then gently, very gently used for cleaning. When finished, you'd rinse it again and leave it in the communal bucket for the next person. That's right, it was shared. This wasn't just a random invention. The tessorium was perfectly suited to Roman values: utility, cleanliness, and public infrastructure. Bathing was an integral part of Roman life. Great care was taken in bodily upkeep. In fact, many of the public latrines were located right beside bathhouses. But imagine the experience: sitting in a carved stone seat, the sound of water trickling beneath you, a sponge soaking in vinegar near your feet, and strangers making polite conversation. Perhaps someone is discussing gladiator matches. Someone else critiques the emperor's latest decree. The act of relieving oneself was casual, communal, and entirely ordinary. Interestingly, the architecture of these latrines shows signs of intentional design. Archaeologists believe that some of the water channels in front of the seats were placed so people could wash their hands or the tessorium before and after use. Some even theorize there may have been soap made from animal fat and ashes nearby, especially in wealthier areas of the city. Of course, not everyone had access to public toilets. In poorer quarters, people often used chamber pots, which were emptied into the street gutters. But for the most part, Rome prided itself on its advanced infrastructure: running water, sewage, and yes, toilet hygiene. In grander villas and estates, wealthy families had their own private latrines, complete with miniature versions of the public models. The tessorium was still used, though the materials might have been finer: a softer sponge, a smoother stick, perhaps even perfumed water for rinsing. Some historians speculate that wealthy Romans occasionally imported sponges from specific parts of the Mediterranean for their quality. Imagine having a designer bathroom sponge. And the Romans were nothing if not thoughtful about comfort. Their benches were often warmed by the sun or heated by nearby hypocaust systems, the same underfloor heating used in their bathhouses. So while we might cringe at the idea of communal toilet sponges, Romans may have sat in comfort, surrounded by warmth and marble. And let's not forget their graffiti. Yes, even in the latrines the Romans left their mark. Scribbled jokes, political slogans, crude drawings, all etched into the stone by someone who clearly had a bit of time to pass. There's even one famous inscription found in a latrine that reads, Apollinaris, the doctor of the emperor, defecated well here. A proud moment apparently. The tessorium, humble as it seems, represents more than just a cleaning tool. It's a glimpse into the Roman world, a world that prized engineering, sanitation, and quite unusually, shared bathroom experiences. And while today we might clutch our perfumed two-ply rolls and lock the bathroom door behind us, in Rome, wiping was a communal ritual, a matter-of-fact routine with its own tools, customs, and social etiquette. So the next time you find yourself sitting comfortably with a bit of privacy, spare a sleepy thought for those ancient Romans, perched side by side on stone benches, sponge sticks in hand, chatting about gladiators, and hoping the vinegar bucket was still fresh. As the mists of time drift softly from the Roman streets, we sail across the Aegean Sea into the sun-washed hills and temples of ancient Greece. Marble columns gleam beneath the blue sky, olives ripen on twisting trees, and the scent of thyme and salt floats gently on the warm wind. This is the cradle of Western philosophy, of Socrates and Plato, of democracy and drama. And yes, of wiping with pottery shards. Yes, truly, in the world of ancient Greece, hygiene was personal, practical, and a bit sharp-edged. The common tools of cleanliness, especially for wiping after relieving oneself, were called pesso, small, rounded pieces of pottery, or smooth pebbles. The word pesso itself means pebbles in Greek, and these humble items were the go-to solution for nature's call. Let's paint the picture. You're a citizen of Athens, in the 5th century BCE. Maybe you're returning from the agora, the city's bustling marketplace, where debates and bartering fill the air. You've worn your himation, a sort of cloak, all morning, and you decide to visit the outhouse in your home courtyard before lunch. There's no toilet paper waiting, no sponge on a stick. Instead, beside a small stone seat, there's a shallow basket of smooth pottery discs, about the size of a cookie, cool to the touch, and gently worn around the edges. They are made from broken pieces of amphorae, jugs that once carried olive oil or wine, or sometimes crafted intentionally for this exact use. They were shaped, smoothed, and sometimes even personalized. Believe it or not, some surviving pessoi have inscriptions. Scholars have discovered fragments with names etched into them, often names of political enemies, rivals, or disliked philosophers. Imagine that, wiping not only in the literal sense, but also in the metaphorical, a very Greek form of passive aggression. You might crouch over a ceramic or wooden seat, reaching for a few pebbles. They'd be held between your fingers and used gently, perhaps one at a time, perhaps more than one depending on need. Once finished, the stones would either be discarded or rinsed and reused. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it was entirely normalized. Some poorer homes may have used rougher stones or bits of hardened clay. Wealthier citizens may have had access to better smoothed pebbles, or a servant who discreetly replaced them after use. The Greeks were practical, yes, but they also valued modesty and discretion. There was no shame in the act, only in being unhygienic. Bathing was frequent, especially among the upper classes. Greek gymnasiums weren't just for training the body, they were places of cleanliness, with baths and communal cleaning rituals involving olive oil and a tool called a strigil, which scraped dirt and sweat off the skin. Cleanliness, then, wasn't just about aesthetics, it was linked to morality, wisdom, and self-discipline. To be clean was to be respectable. To tend to the body was part of tending to the soul. As for public toilets, while not as grand or common as in Rome, there were facilities in temples, gymnasiums, and marketplaces, and these were often fitted with stone seating over shallow troughs or pits, with the pessoi nearby. We can even imagine a philosopher pausing during his dialogue on ethics or metaphysics, walking thoughtfully into a courtyard, and calmly reaching for a pottery shard to clean himself. There's something oddly humbling about it. Plato may have mused about the forms and the soul, but his daily hygiene needs were no more elevated than anyone else's. In the countryside, especially on long journeys between polis, city-states, travelers might collect small pebbles along the roadside to carry in a pouch. Smooth river stones were particularly prized. Some even selected their preferred type of stone, much like someone today might favor a certain brand of tissue. There are even suggestions that children were trained in the use of pesoi early on, taught how to handle them properly, how to clean them, and how to dispose of them. Hygiene was a lesson like any other, taught with care and precision. Over time, as ideas and cultures mingled, especially with Alexander the Great's expansion eastward, Greeks began to encounter other hygiene practices. But the humble stone and ceramic method persisted well into the Hellenistic period. And while it may seem crude to us now, there's an elegant simplicity to it. A small reusable object, no waste, no flushing required, just the cool curve of pottery, shaped by hands long forgotten, used in moments of quiet necessity. So as you lie back and let sleep gently approach, picture a sun-dappled courtyard, a terracotta jug of water, a low wooden bench, and a thoughtful Greek citizen, perhaps humming a verse of Homer, carrying out the most ordinary of tasks with quiet dignity. After all, even the minds that shaped civilization still had to wipe. Now, let the winds of time carry us east, across the steppes, over the mountain ranges, and into the emerald heart of ancient China, a land of towering pagodas, mist-covered rivers, and whispering bamboo forests. Here, in dynasties that spanned centuries, toilet paper was not only imagined, it was, eventually, invented. But long before paper became a luxury found even in the lavatory, the people of Imperial China had their own surprisingly clever solutions. Let us drift first into the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE. The cities are humming with traders, artisans, scholars, and courtiers. In the homes of farmers and the halls of noblemen, the day begins with ritual, tea, calligraphy, a moment of calm. Cleanliness, as in so many ancient societies, is deeply valued. And while there is no toilet paper just yet, hygiene is far from neglected. Imagine a quiet courtyard, tiled with stone. A household servant sweeps fallen plum blossoms into a neat pile. A nearby structure, simple, wooden, shaded, serves as the family latrine. Inside you find what looks like a smooth spatula carved from bamboo, slightly curved, flat, tapered at the end. This was known as a cho, or salaka stick. Its purpose, intimate cleansing. To use it required a certain technique, one passed down with dignity and discretion, and afterward, the stick would be carefully cleaned, perhaps wiped with cloth, rinsed in a nearby basin, and set to dry under the sun. The bamboo was naturally antimicrobial, and with regular care, these tools could be reused safely. This method wasn't exclusive to one class. From the countryside to the palace, bamboo spatulas were common. Travelers would carry them on the road. Servants would replace them in the home. Entire manuals from later dynasties referenced them, suggesting they were not just accepted, but expected. But not everyone used bamboo. For those who walked among silken robes and lacquered furniture, members of the imperial court and wealthy elite, there was another material available, silk itself. Soft, absorbent, luxurious, scraps of worn silk, unsuitable for sewing, were repurposed for personal hygiene. Of course, silk was a treasure in ancient China. It had to be spun from countless silkworms, harvested carefully, and woven with painstaking attention. To wipe with silk, then, was a mark of status. It is said that during the later Tang dynasty, nobles would have baskets of silk scraps near their private toilet chambers, sometimes perfumed with lotus or chrysanthemum oils. Some were embroidered with floral designs. These were not shared. These were for the individual, used once, then discarded or burned. And while we might scoff at the extravagance, it is worth remembering this was a society where the details of living were an art. Tea ceremonies, poetry, furniture placement, even bathroom rituals were attended to with elegance. By the 6th century, however, something remarkable began to shift. Paper had already existed in China for centuries, used primarily for writing and record keeping. But by now, it had become widespread enough for new uses. People began using coarse, thick paper for hygiene. In a record from around 589 AD, a Chinese scholar remarked that he would never use paper with writing on it for such a purpose, indicating that wiping with blank paper had already become common. And then came the 14th century. During the Ming Dynasty, it is said that paper specifically made for bathroom use was being mass-produced in some provinces. In one particularly astonishing record, officials noted that the imperial court had ordered over 700,000 sheets of toilet paper, some even perfumed, for the royal family. These sheets were not like the soft rolls we know today. They were square, flat, and made from bamboo pulp. But they were disposable, clean, and frankly ahead of their time. While much of the world was still using leaves, hay, and shells, China had entered the age of paper. Even before this, though, the care given to hygiene in China is evident. Lavatories were often separated from living quarters. Water was used in combination with wiping tools, and herbs like mugwort or mint were sometimes burned in or near latrines to mask odors and purify the space. It's important to remember that for the Chinese, hygiene was not merely physical, it was spiritual. Cleanliness was a form of respect, a harmony with nature, a ritual gently woven into the rhythm of the day. So picture it now: a noble's chamber in ancient Hangzhou, a polished wooden floor, a folding screen with brush-painted cranes, a small carved stand holding neatly folded paper or silk scraps. Perhaps a bamboo tool rests beside a basin, glinting in morning light. Or further away, in a village nestled between rice paddies, a farmer emerges from an outhouse with a small cloth pouch, inside it a single bamboo spatula, worn smooth from years of use, but still serving its purpose with quiet grace. Whether bamboo or silk, paper or wood, China was a land that brought refinement even to the most private of tasks. And as you close your eyes now, drifting deeper into slumber, think of that bamboo forest swaying in the evening breeze, of the soft scratch of a brush on parchment, and the curious, comforting knowledge that even 2,000 years ago, someone, somewhere, was thoughtfully deciding how best to wipe. Let us remain in the East, but drift a little further to the island nation of Japan. Picture it now: the early morning mist clings to the pine trees as the sun rises over Mount Fuji. Wooden shoji screens slide open to the sound of rustling kimono fabric, and somewhere in a quiet corner of a traditional home, a task both ordinary and essential is about to take place. This is feudal Japan, an era defined by shoguns and samurai, where poetry was composed beside battle plans, and even the smallest domestic routines were shaped by discipline, grace, and purpose. And when it came to personal hygiene, the Japanese had their own thoughtful solution. The tool they used was called the shoji, a slim, carefully smoothed stick of wood, similar in some ways to China's bamboo spatula, but uniquely refined to match the Japanese aesthetic of simplicity and intentional design. Made from bamboo or polished wood, the shoji was shaped with gentle curves and often measured about the length of a forearm. One end was flattened, like a miniature paddle, while the other might be gently tapered. It was kept clean, stored with care, and used with surprising finesse. Public lavatories were rare in early feudal Japan. Instead, toilets were private, modest areas tucked away in homes, temples, or inns. A traditional lavatory might be a simple wooden platform with a hole over a pit, often covered with straw or ash to control odors. And beside it, the shoji. Sometimes there were several, resting on a wooden rack. Each shoji was cleaned after use, often with hot water and a cloth. In more refined households they were dried in the sun, perhaps wiped with a bit of rice wine to cleanse and purify. These sticks were not disposable, they were personal, reusable, and part of a quiet routine. To use one was not considered unpleasant, but merely a matter of hygiene, done gently, with care. The samurai class, for instance, were not only warriors but scholars of ritual and discipline. Their lives were structured around codes of honor, known as bushido. This extended to everything, even how one relieved oneself. To tend to the body was an extension of self-respect, and so, the shoji was handled not casually, but respectfully. In temples, monks practiced cleanliness as part of spiritual discipline. Many temples had small latrines with water basins nearby. Here, shoji were used in silence, cleaned ritually, and stored with deliberate mindfulness. But not all of Japan's hygiene traditions relied solely on wiping. In many homes, especially those near rivers or with access to fresh water, cleansing was also done with water. Wooden ladles and scooping bowls were common. It was not unusual to combine water washing with wiping, especially in wealthier areas where resources allowed for such dual practices. And let's not forget Japan's deep relationship with bathing. While baths were for relaxation and full-body cleansing, they also reinforced the cultural value of cleanliness as calm, as reverence, as something close to the divine. Thus, even a humble shoji was not just a tool. it was part of a lifestyle. Its presence beside the toilet spoke of ritual, repetition, and respect for the natural rhythms of life. Interestingly, artisans would sometimes carve small designs into the wood, subtle wave patterns, a family crest, or a poem written in miniature kanji script. A delicate reminder that even the simplest object could be made beautiful. That functionality did not preclude grace. Imagine now a country inn on a rainy spring evening, travelers removing their sandals, warming themselves beside a charcoal brazier, and in a quiet washroom, lit by the soft glow of an oil lamp, a shoji rests beside a wooden water basin. The sound of a ladle dipping into cool water, the rustle of paper sliding shut. Outside, rain patters on the roof tiles. Inside, all is calm. Even in urban Edo, where the population swelled and space was limited, hygiene practices retained a sense of decorum. Public toilets eventually developed in larger cities, with separate areas for men and women. These facilities often included communal choji that were cleaned regularly and used in rotation. Yet despite their practicality, these tools eventually began to fade with the passage of time. As Western influences crept into Japan in the late 19th century, paper hygiene products were introduced. Soft papers, imported technologies, and later, flush toilets slowly replaced traditional tools. But the memory of the shoji lives on, in museums, old scrolls, and the quiet whispers of history. So as you lie there now, letting the story settle gently in your mind, think of that polished wooden stick. Think of the hands that carved it, the quiet rooms it once sat in, the rhythm of its daily use. In a world that often seems chaotic, there's something deeply soothing about a people who treated even wiping with such grace. A gentle tool, a gentle act, and a history carved in wood and silence. Now we cross time and sea to a colder, cloudier land. The light dims, the air grows damp, and the stone walls of castles rise like jagged silhouettes on the horizon. Welcome to medieval Europe, a time of plagues and prayers, knights and nuns, serfs and kings, and a toilet situation that was, to say the least, rustic. In this chapter of history, elegance gave way to practicality. There were no perfumed sheets of silk, no carved bamboo tools, just raw, honest nature and a lot of creativity. Let us begin, not in a grand manner, but in the life of an average peasant. Picture a wooden cottage tucked beside a muddy road, its thatched roof slumped with age. Inside, a family sleeps in a single room, a fire burns low, chickens cluck outside. Somewhere nearby, maybe behind a small screen or just outside the back door, is the privy, a pit in the earth. A wooden bench with a hole cut through, cold, dark, and often smelly. And beside it, a bundle of soft green moss. Yes, moss. Across the forests and fields of northern Europe, moss was one of nature's gifts, soft, spongy, and abundant. It grew in shady glades and between stones. People would gather it, dry it a bit, and store it for wiping. And it worked. Absorbent, biodegradable, and surprisingly gentle. If moss wasn't available, there were alternatives. Leaves, for example. Broad, flexible ones like mully were often favored in summer. In winter, less forgiving options. Hay, straw, or bits of linen rag. In fact, linen rags were a go-to for many, especially among those with access to old, worn clothing. When a shirt or tunic became too tattered to wear, it was repurposed, torn into strips, softened by years of wear, used and reused until it could be used no more. Wealthier families might have had dedicated cloths for hygiene, washed in a bucket, hung to dry, and rotated regularly. But laundering was time-consuming and water-intensive. For most people, this wasn't a luxury they could often afford. There were even whispers of more desperate measures, bits of wool, handfuls of hay, even on rare and chilly occasions, snow. Yes, snow. Imagine the jolt, the wide eyes, the sudden shiver of using a snowball for such a purpose. But for some in the alpine regions or far north, it was not only available, it was free, clean, and easy to discard. Let's not forget the chamber pot. For those in castles or urban houses, the chamber pot was an essential piece of furniture. Kept under beds or in corners, it was used during the night and emptied in the morning, often flung out of windows with a careless shout of "Guard Lou," literally, watch out for the water. In castles, a different solution existed, the garderobe. These were stone toilet niches, built into the thick outer walls of the fortress. A wooden seat opened directly over a chute, or sometimes just an open drop to the moat or the base of the wall. There was no plumbing, no flushing, just gravity and good luck. Wiping in such places was often done with hay, straw, or even animal fur, if one had it. Scented herbs, like lavender or thyme, might be scattered to mask the smell. In colder climates, a cloth might be warmed by the fire before use, a small comfort in a stone-walled world. Monasteries had their own unique approach. Monks lived structured lives, bells for prayers, silence during meals, and communal toilets in long stone rooms, known as reredatas. Here, rows of holes sat above flowing water channels. Monks would sit in quiet contemplation, relieve themselves, and wipe with cloth or plant material. It's said that some monasteries reused old manuscript pages for this purpose, parchment worn smooth and no longer suitable for sacred texts. While the idea might seem tragic to lovers of literature, it was practical at the time. And after all, once the ink had faded, the words were considered spent. In towns, things weren't much better. Public latrines were rare, and most people relied on personal pots or open defecation in fields and alleys. Streets often ran with waste, and hygiene was, let's say, a low priority. Diseases spread easily, rats thrived, and still people wiped with what they had. Old wool, horsehair, soft feathers, shavings of wood, anything that wasn't too rough, too sharp, or too valuable. Water was also used when available. A basin near the toilet, or a jug of rainwater, might be kept nearby. But again, water was precious, especially in cities where wells were few and diseases lingered in every stagnant drop. It's easy to romanticize the medieval world. Knights in shining armor, fair maidens in rose gardens, but the truth was far less glamorous. Hygiene was an ongoing battle, fought daily with creativity, courage, and a surprisingly flexible approach to materials. But even here, in the simplest of moments, there was ingenuity. Imagine it, a small bundle of moss collected from the forest, a piece of soft cloth hung beside the door, a pot of ashes mixed with herbs to dry and deodorize the latrine. Life was harder then, but not without its solutions. So as you drift further into sleep, wrapped in your soft sheets, consider the world before flush toilets and paper rolls. A world of moss and straw, of hay bales and snowballs. A world where people did what they could, with what they had, and carried on. Because sometimes, survival means figuring out the little things, even how to wipe. Now let us journey southward and eastward once more, into the golden sands and warm breeze of the medieval Islamic world. A world of calligraphy and domes, of perfumed markets and silent desert nights, where the flicker of lanterns danced across tiled walls, and water gurgled in fountains built not just for beauty, but for cleanliness. This is the Islamic Golden Age, and here hygiene wasn't just practical, it was sacred. In this part of the world, unlike in much of Europe at the time, cleanliness was tied deeply to faith. The Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, place strong emphasis on personal purification. Cleanliness wasn't optional, it was part of prayer, of daily ritual, of spiritual mindfulness. And so when it came to the matter of relieving oneself, the approach was both simple and deeply considered. There was no sponge on a stick here, no pottery shards, no leaves or moss, just water. The primary method for cleaning after using the toilet was thorough washing with water, known as istinja, and it was done with the left hand. Why the left? Because in Islamic etiquette, the left hand is reserved for personal hygiene, while the right is used for eating, greeting, and noble tasks. It is a tradition rooted in both practicality and spiritual intention. Imagine now a small courtyard in 9th century Baghdad. The city is alive with learning, home to scholars, translators, mathematicians. But here, tucked behind a tiled wall, is a private latrine. Beside the squat toilet, there is no roll of paper, no cloth, just a simple, elegant ibrick, a narrow-necked jug of water. After relieving oneself, water is poured gently using the right hand, while the left hand aids in cleansing. The process is done quietly, mindfully, and thoroughly. And then the hands are washed, usually with soap made from olive oil or ashes. Sometimes ashes were mixed with water to form a soft, natural scrubbing agent. In desert regions where water was scarce, stones or dry materials like sand might be used, followed by washing as soon as water became available. But the ideal method, always, was water. To someone unfamiliar with this method, it might seem surprising, but to those in the Islamic world, it was the norm. Entire architectural styles evolved around it. Homes were built with latrines near courtyards, where water could be stored. Public bathhouses, called hammams, became not just places of cleansing, but of community and conversation. In cities like Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus, latrines were often small private spaces connected to sophisticated sewer systems. Water was brought in with clay pipes or drawn from wells. The humble ibrik or afterburner was always close by, sometimes carved from copper, sometimes clay, but always present. And this tradition extended across a vast region, from the libraries of Baghdad to the minarets of Al-Andalus, across the deserts of North Africa, and into the spice-scented islands of Southeast Asia. Even travelers carried water vessels. A merchant on the Silk Road, for instance, might stop in a shaded grove, draw his water from a goatskin pouch, and perform his ablutions before continuing on his way.
It was simply a way of life.
And what's more remarkable is that this focus on cleanliness led to better health outcomes than in many other regions at the time. With regular washing, the spread of disease was reduced, especially in crowded urban centers. In wealthier homes, private latrines were tiled with glazed ceramics. The ibrik might be ornate, etched with geometric patterns or verses from poetry.
Yet, the act
remained the same, quiet,
yet
dignified,
clean.
Even today, in many parts of the Muslim world, this practice continues. Modern bidets, handheld sprays, and water jugs are simply updated versions of the ibrik. The principle, using water for cleansing, remains unchanged across centuries. And so, as you settle deeper into your pillow, think of a tiled courtyard in Fez or Istanbul, the soft splash of water from a brass jug, the hush of palm fronds swaying above. The idea that cleanliness is not just physical, but spiritual, not just functional, but graceful. A reminder that even in the most basic acts, there can be beauty, in the silence of ritual, in the cool pour of water, in the calm of doing things with intention. Not every culture wiped, some cleansed, and in doing so, left behind a legacy of dignity and clarity. Let us now step softly away from grand empires and stone cities, past marble columns and copper jugs. Let us wander into the forests, across the prairies, and into the high mountain valleys, into the sacred, deeply rooted traditions of indigenous tribes, where nature wasn't something to be tamed, it was home. Here, people lived close to the land. They knew its cycles, its plants, its textures, and when it came to hygiene, they turned not to imported cloth or crafted sticks, but to the world around them, alive, green, and familiar. In this chapter, we won't explore a single civilization. We will wander from the rain-drenched Amazon basin to the snowy peaks of the Andes, from the arid plains of central North America to the misty Pacific Northwest. Every people had their own methods, drawn from what nature offered them. Let us begin in South America. Among the Quechua-speaking peoples of the Andes, smooth stones were used for wiping, especially those rounded by glacial rivers, easy to rinse, easy to carry, and always nearby. In highland regions, where trees were scarce and paper unheard of, these stones were the practical choice. Some traditions even mention the use of small bundles of alpaca wool, especially among the wealthier or ceremonial castes. These would be used sparingly, perhaps only during rituals, or for the sick and elderly. In the lush lowlands among tribes of the Amazon rainforest, the approach was entirely different. There, the forest provided an abundance of leaves, broad, strong, soft. The trick wasn't just grabbing the nearest leaf, but knowing which plants were safe. Some leaves were used specifically because of their soothing or antiseptic properties. Others were avoided due to toxins or itching agents. Knowledge passed from elder to child, not in textbooks, but in quiet moments while gathering firewood or walking a trail. Further north, we find ourselves on the plains of North America. Here, the mullein plant became a beloved standby. Soft, fuzzy leaves, gentle on the skin. So favored was mullein for wiping that some settlers later dubbed it cowboy toilet paper. It grew tall and sun-loving, and was easily found in open fields. Other tribes used corn husks, especially those in farming communities. After the harvest, the husks were stripped, dried, and stored. Their texture, once softened, was durable and efficient. Corn was life-giving in more ways than one. In colder regions, especially among the Inuit and other Arctic peoples, a different set of materials was used. Snow, yes, but also sedge grass, which was dried and bundled into pads. Sometimes even animal fur, carefully cleaned and reserved for this task, especially in the winter months when other options were frozen or buried. Among the tribes of the Pacific Northwest, cedar bark was sometimes used, peeled and softened, almost like fibrous cloth. Cedar had natural antimicrobial properties, and its soft inner layers, when prepared correctly, were surprisingly comfortable. The key in all of these traditions wasn't just resourcefulness, it was respect. The forest was not a store, the field was not a garbage dump. People took only what they needed, and they left the rest. There was no paper waste, no sewage treatment, no plastic packaging. Everything returned to the earth. It's easy to imagine a morning long ago, a young girl walking with her grandmother in a clearing. The older woman stoops and points to a certain leaf. "This one," she says. "Not that one. This one won't sting." Or a hunter on the plains, crouching by the river. He finds a smooth, familiar stone, not too big, not too small. He knows exactly what to do. Hygiene wasn't written down. It was taught in gestures, in repetition, in understanding. It was learned slowly, respectfully, just like the land itself, and it wasn't always just about cleaning. In many cultures, there were cleansing rituals, herbal smokes, water baths, even prayers offered during or after private moments. The act of wiping, of purifying, was also spiritual. In some Amazonian communities, certain herbs were burned near the latrine to keep away insects and purify the air. Among the Lakota and other plains tribes, sweat lodges were places of both physical and spiritual cleansing. In those warm, dark domes, after sweating out sickness and fatigue, people would bathe and clean themselves thoroughly. And when the day ended, when the fire burned low and the wind whispered through the leaves, people lay down to sleep, not worrying about scented paper or silver fixtures, but simply trusting in the earth beneath them, and the knowledge passed through generations. So as you drift off now, think of those quiet forests and open skies. Think of leaves gathered carefully, of stones warmed by sun, of bark and grass turned to soft, natural tools. Think of hands that knew the land so well, that even the act of wiping was done with harmony, not haste. There's something deeply peaceful in that, something ancient, something worth remembering. Now the winds of history carry us north, past evergreen forests and fjords carved by glaciers. The sea grows colder, the nights longer, and the air brims with the salty breath of ocean spray. Welcome to the world of the Vikings, seafaring warriors, traders, farmers, and as it turns out, surprisingly attentive homemakers when it came to hygiene. Though their image is often painted with axes and longboats, the Vikings were not unwashed barbarians. In fact, the evidence points quite clearly to the opposite. They bathed more often than many of their medieval neighbors, groomed themselves with care, and practiced basic cleanliness in surprisingly refined ways. And yes, they wiped too, using a variety of materials, the most favored among them being wool and water. Let us begin in a typical Viking homestead. It's a low timber-framed longhouse, with thick turf on the roof to keep out the cold. Inside it smells of wood smoke, dried herbs and stew. The family rises with the dawn, preparing for a day of fishing, farming or weaving. And somewhere off to the side, perhaps behind a wooden partition, or even just a secluded spot outdoors, is the latrine. Not a grand structure, but a simple pit dug into the ground, covered by a platform with a seat carved into it. Nearby there's a bundle of wool cloth, frayed and softened through long use. Wool was readily available in the Norse world. Sheep were a staple of Viking farming, and their wool was spun, woven, and worn in garments from infancy to old age. When clothing wore out, or was no longer fit for use, pieces were often repurposed, and that included for personal hygiene. Wool was absorbent, it was warm, and once worn thin, it was soft enough to be used delicately. Rags of old tunics, cloaks or blankets might be kept near the latrine for wiping. These were not thrown away, but washed, dried and reused. For those on the move, sailors, raiders, traders venturing across the North Sea. Cloth was not always practical, and so, nature stepped in. In the forests and valleys of Scandinavia, moss was often used, just as it was in other parts of medieval Europe. So too were flat stones, snow and handfuls of clean hay. But perhaps most interesting of all was the Viking use of water. Wherever fresh water was available, springs, streams, or even melted snow, Vikings would rinse rather than wipe. This was especially common in rural settings, or during long stays in nature. They didn't have plumbing, but they did have buckets, ladles, and clever ways of channeling water from nearby sources. In some sagas, bathing and washing rituals are mentioned casually, as part of life. Hair was combed, beards were trimmed, and while toilet habits are rarely described directly, the presence of grooming kits, including tweezers, razors, and ear spoons, suggests that cleanliness was not only expected, it was important. In fact, when Christian monks first encountered Norsemen, they wrote with mild astonishment at how clean the Vikings were. Some even complained that Viking men were so well groomed that local women found them too attractive. Imagine that Viking charm enhanced by a commitment to personal hygiene. Back in the homestead, after wiping with wool or rinsing with water, the cloth would be placed in a basin. Later, it would be washed, perhaps in a stream with lye soap made from ash and animal fat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. Even on longships, Vikings found ways to stay clean. Buckets of seawater, rainwater collected from sails, and fastidious habits kept their cramped quarters bearable. Wiping may have involved rags kept in sealed jars or sacks, protected from salt and wind. And in the depths of winter, when snow blanketed the earth and rivers froze over, you guessed it, snowballs, used carefully of course, packed with just enough softness to avoid frostbite, but firm enough to do the job. Snow was nature's coldest cleansing tool, and one that left no waste behind. The Viking way was always practical. They lived in a harsh climate, sailed rough seas, and made do with what they had. But they also honored their bodies, their homes, and their customs. Even wiping was done with intention, using materials that were natural, available, and often reused. So as you rest now, wrapped in warm blankets far softer than any Viking cloak, think of those northern lands, of a low fire crackling in the hearth, of a woolen rag resting on a wooden bench, of a stream trickling through a pine forest, its waters clear and cold, and of a people who, despite their fierce reputation, found dignity even in the smallest acts. In that quiet corner of the longhouse, wiping wasn't just necessity, it was part of the rhythm of life. We now ride eastward once more, across the wind-swept plains of Central Asia. The grass bends in rippling waves beneath the hooves of horses. Yurts stand in circles like fabric sentinels across the steppe. The sky above stretches endlessly, a ceiling of pale blue or stormy grey. This is the land of the Mongols, nomadic, rugged, resourceful. And here, life was governed not by stone walls or marble statues, but by movement, endurance, and an intimate knowledge of nature. In a world without plumbing, paper, or indoor facilities, how did the Mongols wipe? Their answer, much like the people themselves, was adaptable, tough, and often unexpected. Let us step into a yurt, also known as a gyr, a circular tent of wooden latticework, covered in felt made from wool. It is warm inside, despite the frost that coats the grass outside. A fire smolders in the center. Around the edges, blankets are folded, dried meats are stored, and saddles rest, ready for the next journey. When nature called, the process was simple. Step outside. There was no need for outhouses. The land was vast and open. One would walk a short distance from camp, find a quiet spot, often behind a small hill or under the shadow of a rock, and squat. Modesty was maintained, not with walls, but with space. And once finished, that's where Mongol ingenuity came in. Depending on the terrain and resources at hand, Mongols used a variety of materials. One of the most common, leather scraps. Leather was a byproduct of their lifestyle. Horses, sheep, goats, and yaks were all part of their daily lives. Their hides were tanned and used for everything: clothing, bags, armor, footwear. And when the scraps were too small or worn for sewing, they were repurposed. Some families kept small pouches of soft leather pieces for hygiene, used much like a cloth, then cleaned and reused. The leather could be rinsed in water from a nearby stream or river, or scrubbed with snow or dry grass. But when leather wasn't available, or in harsher environments like the Gobi Desert, another tool stepped in: sand. Yes, sand. A handful of dry, powdery earth could be surprisingly effective. The fine grit provided a kind of natural scrubbing. After use, the hands were washed, or wiped clean with grass or snow, depending on the season. It may sound uncomfortable, but for the Mongols, who endured fierce winters, brutal wind, and endless miles on horseback, it was simply part of life. It worked. It required no storage, no maintenance, no burden. Other materials included smooth stones, dried grass, or even sticks, though carefully chosen to avoid splinters. In winter, snowballs were used much like in the far north, but instead of being an occasional necessity, they were a seasonal norm. What's perhaps most fascinating is how clean the Mongols tried to remain, despite their rugged conditions. Yurts had a designated area for washing. Buckets or skins filled with water would be used for rinsing hands and feet. Soap wasn't always available, but ashes from the hearth or animal fats were sometimes mixed into rudimentary cleansers. And while the Mongols may not have had bathhouses, they made up for it with steam tents. Much like a sauna, these temporary shelters were filled with steam generated by pouring water over hot stones. People would sweat, scrape, and scrub away dirt, a full-body cleanse done without running water or bathtubs. Even their horses were kept clean, brushed, and groomed regularly. Mongol saddles were layered with felt to prevent sores, and even the most hardened warriors took time to tend to both themselves and their animals. It's said that Genghis Khan himself enforced standards of cleanliness among his men. Campgrounds were kept tidy, waste was buried or moved away, and despite being feared as fierce conquerors, the Mongols were often more hygienic than the sedentary peoples they encountered. Imagine now the rhythm of a day on the steppe. The morning begins with the rising sun glowing golden over the grasslands. A young boy rides bareback across the plain, rounding up goats. His grandmother, wrapped in wool, steps from the yurt and walks quietly into the landscape, leather cloth in hand. The silence is broken only by the wind. Later, someone fetches water, someone else gathers kindling, and the used cloths are rinsed in the stream with a quiet patience. No toilet paper, no plumbing, no problem. Just the land, and the wisdom to use it. As you lie back now, the hum of modern life fading, imagine the calm of that open space, a world without walls, without the whir of electric fans or flushing pipes, just earth, wind, wool, and sky, and the simple knowledge that even the great Mongol Empire, builder of the largest land-based dominion in history, was shaped by people who found time, each and every day, to wipe, wash, and wander on. Now let us step gently into the early settlements of colonial America. The air is crisp and filled with the scent of pine and fresh earth. Smoke drifts lazily from stone chimneys. Wooden houses creak in the wind. Here, life is slower, harder, and simpler. The tools are few. The comforts are earned. And when it comes to hygiene, especially wiping, creativity once again becomes a daily necessity. In this world before supermarkets and plumbing, people used what they had. And in the American colonies, one thing they had plenty of was corn, fields of tall stalks swaying in the breeze. Corn was a staple crop, a source of nourishment, animal feed, even currency in trade. But its usefulness didn't end when the kernels were gone. What remained, the dried corn cobs, found a second life in the outhouse. Yes, the humble corn cob, dried, hollow, and surprisingly textured. In rural farmsteads and frontier cabins, corn cobs were a common wiping tool. Let's picture it. It's a chilly morning in 1774. You've just stepped outside your log cabin, boots crunching over frost-covered ground. You pass the root cellar, the chicken coop, and finally reach the outhouse, a tall wooden box, often perched a little ways off from the main home, both for modesty and for the smell. Inside, the seat is a wide wooden plank with a hole. There's no light except what slips through the cracks. Hanging from a hook, or placed in a corner, is a basket, and inside it, corn cobs, cleaned, dried, maybe smoothed by years of use. They weren't thrown away after a single use. Instead, they were wiped, rinsed, and used again. Placed back in a basket to be cleaned later, just like cloth diapers were. Some families even had preferred cobs, softer, older, less abrasive. Others would wrap them in scraps of fabric for a bit more comfort. The idea might make modern listeners wince, but for the colonists it was normal, just another part of life on the edge of wilderness. But corn cobs weren't the only solution. If you happened to be a bit more literary, or simply had a pile of old paper, you might also find yourself wiping with newspapers, letters, or more famously, almanacs. The Farmer's Almanac, a booklet filled with planting schedules, moon phases and home remedies, became an unlikely hero of the outhouse. It was printed on coarse paper, easy to tear, and best of all, it came with a small hole in the corner, not for decoration, but for hanging from a nail inside the latrine. Once read, its pages could be used one at a time. Some even joked that it was the book with a second purpose. Later, the Sears Roebuck catalogue would take over that role. It was thick, free, and filled with not only advertisements, but plenty of pages. People flipped through its listings of boots, hats, and farm tools while attending to their needs, then tore a page off, folded it, and put it to use. It was recycling, long before anyone used the term. In wealthier urban homes, or among merchants who had access to fabrics, old rags might be used instead. These cloths were washed and reused, but laundering them, especially in winter, was a difficult task, so they weren't the norm for everyone. In the warmer southern colonies, leaves were also common, especially from soft broad plants, like lamb's ear, mullein, or even cotton. These were gathered and stacked for easy access. In areas near rivers, water might be used in combination with wiping materials. One thing is clear, toilet paper, as we know it, didn't exist, and no one missed it, because they didn't expect it. What they valued was practicality, efficiency, and often a bit of humor. Jokes about wiping materials were common in colonial writing. Children giggled about using last week's news, and some families passed down funny stories about who used the roughest cob, or how fast the almanac ran out. And beyond the daily habits, there was also a certain intimacy to the outhouse. It was a quiet place, a moment alone, a break from the bustle of chores, cooking, and tending to livestock. In the dead of night, it might mean lighting a lantern, wrapping oneself in a shawl, and stepping out into the cold. Stars above, crickets singing, the hush of wind in the trees. Even wiping, in that world, was part of the rhythm of the land. Simple, direct, no waste. So as you settle into your own warm bed tonight, wrapped in cotton and surrounded by comforts unknown to colonists, think of the outhouse glowing faintly in the moonlight, of a smooth basket of corn cobs waiting patiently, of a torn Sears catalogue fluttering in the breeze, and smile perhaps at how history finds ways to be both surprising and humbling. Now we travel further still, across deserts that shimmer under the sun, through rainforests alive with birdsong, and into savannas where acacia trees stretch toward the horizon. This is pre-colonial Africa, vast, diverse, and ancient, a continent of kingdoms and clans, villages and empires, each with their own ways of life, beliefs, and yes, even hygiene practices. Here, long before the arrival of European colonizers, people had developed their own practical, sustainable methods of personal cleanliness. When it came to wiping after relieving oneself, they turned to the land that surrounded them, and the land, in return, provided all they needed. Let's begin with one of the most universal tools in African hygiene, the leaf. Across much of sub-Saharan Africa, broad, soft leaves were a common and favored option. Just as in other parts of the world, they were chosen carefully. Not every leaf would do. Elders passed down knowledge about which plants were best. Some were known for their silky texture, others for their antiseptic properties. Some, of course, were to be avoided entirely. Stinging nettles and toxic varieties were no one's idea of a good wipe. In West African forests, plants like kepkap bole shito, African basil, tete amaranth, and the large soft leaves of the pawpaw tree were commonly used. They were often plucked fresh each morning and stacked neatly near the designated toilet area, whether it was a private latrine, a communal pit, or simply a quiet space in nature. In some villages, leaves were folded or rolled into little bundles, creating a more absorbent and layered wipe. Once used, they would simply be discarded into the bush or buried, returning to the soil in a quiet, natural cycle. But leaves were only part of the story. In drier regions, where vegetation was sparse, people turned to a more unusual tool, ash. Yes, Ashes from cooking fires, carefully cooled and sifted, were used as a form of dry cleansing. The fine, powdery texture of wood ash acted almost like a natural soap. It was mildly abrasive, capable of scrubbing away residue, and often carried mild antibacterial properties, depending on the type of wood burned. A person would take a small handful of ash, apply it as needed, and then rinse with water if available, or simply brush off the excess. In many communities, a pot of cool ash sat near the toilet area, much like a modern container of wipes or tissues. It was humble, but effective. Ash was also used to deodorize toilet pits and latrines. After use, a scoop of ash would be sprinkled into the hole, covering waste and helping to reduce odor and flies. This simple act made shared toilet areas far more bearable and hygienic, and there were still more methods, depending on the region. In the highlands of Ethiopia, flat stones or smooth wooden paddles were occasionally used. In the dry expanses of Namibia, people used tufts of dry grass or woven palm fronds. In Madagascar, where forests met coastal plains, coconut husks were repurposed much like in Pacific Island cultures. Wherever you go on this continent, one thing remains constant: a deep understanding of the environment. Hygiene was not an afterthought, it was a reflection of how well one lived in harmony with nature. Children were taught early how to gather the right leaves, how to sprinkle ash safely, how to keep the latrine tidy. These lessons weren't formal, but practical, spoken softly as a mother worked beside her daughter, or as a grandfather explained why that tree should never be touched. But this one was perfect. In some spiritual traditions, the act of relieving oneself and then cleansing was also ritualistic. Among the Yoruba, the act of washing after defecation was not just about the body, but about clearing negative energy. Cleanliness was linked with purity, both inside and out. Certain tribes even developed custom toilet areas far from the village, screened by reeds or clay walls, positioned carefully to protect water sources and crops. Waste was often buried or scattered far from homes, in line with traditional ecological wisdom, and hygiene tools weren't always disposable. In some places, personal wiping stones or cloths were used repeatedly, washed in streams, and dried in the sun. While rare, these tools served as durable alternatives in regions where leaves were seasonal or ash was limited. But above all, it was the respect for nature that defined pre-colonial African hygiene practices. No waste, no plastics, no paper left to clutter the land, just leaves that withered into soil, ash that returned to the earth, water poured from a calabash, hands scrubbed with sand or soap berries, and bodies cleansed under the open sky. So now, as you lie back beneath your own roof, far from the vast plains and forest paths, think of those quiet places beneath the baobab tree. Think of green leaves folded with care, of children giggling while fetching ash, of the rhythm of life in a village where everything had its place, even wiping, and how, in the simplest routines, there was harmony. Now the breeze grows warmer again, the scent of salt water drifts through the air, palm trees sway above powdery white sands. We have arrived in the Pacific Islands, a sprawling tapestry of archipelagos and atolls scattered like jewels across the great ocean. From Hawaii in the north to Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, Tahiti, and hundreds more, each with its own culture, language, and rhythm of life. And across these islands, long before ships arrived bearing foreign goods or customs, people lived in deep harmony with their surroundings. The sea provided food, the forest gave shelter, and even in matters of hygiene, nature offered everything they needed. When it came to wiping, the people of the Pacific turned to the very trees that shaped their world, especially the tree of life itself, the coconut palm. Let's step into a quiet village on a warm afternoon. Children splash in the lagoon, elders sit weaving baskets from palm fronds, and someone tends to a cooking fire with smoky fish. Tucked behind a screen of leaves or over a gentle rise in the land is the family's latrine, often a simple open-air spot nestled among the trees. Beside it lies a pile of dried coconut husks. The coconut used for drinking, eating, building, even storytelling, was also used for wiping. The husk, fibrous and layered, could be torn into strips or shaped into pads. Its texture, once dried and softened by time, was absorbent and durable. Some people would rub the husk gently between their hands or against a stone to soften the fibers before use. Others used it as is, particularly when cleanliness mattered more than comfort, and once used, The husk could be tossed onto a compost heap or burned as fuel. It was an elegant solution, natural, biodegradable, and completely in rhythm with the island environment. But that wasn't the only tool in the islanders' toolkit. Seashells were also used, particularly larger, smooth-edged types, like conchs or cowries. These were selected carefully, not too sharp, not cracked, held gently in hand. They could be used to scrape and wipe, then rinsed in the sea or with fresh water. Imagine the simplicity of it, walking a few steps from the water's edge, using what nature offered, and leaving no waste behind. The ocean cleansed, the sun dried, the cycle continued. In more forested islands, banana leaves and taro leaves were also common. These broad, soft leaves were ideal, large enough to fold or layer, flexible enough to use gently, and abundant year-round. Some leaves were even crushed slightly to release natural oils, making the experience smoother and less abrasive. In Fiji, for example, it was common to keep a bundle of folded leaves near the bathing area. After relieving oneself, a person might wipe, then walk into the shallows of the sea to rinse. Bathing and toileting were often linked, not as separate acts, but as one continuous rhythm of cleansing. Water was abundant, whether from the ocean, rivers, or collected rain. Many island homes had rain catchment systems, where water flowed from thatched rooftops into clay or bamboo containers. This water was used for drinking, cooking, and rinsing. And unlike in colder climates, where waste had to be managed carefully to avoid contamination, the warm, humid conditions of the Pacific allowed for faster natural decomposition. Pit toilets were common, dug into the sandy ground, ringed by logs or stones, and used communally. Waste was covered with ash or leaves, and the site was moved every few months to allow the earth to renew. In coastal villages, toilets were sometimes built on stilts above the water, allowing waste to be washed away by the tide. Crude by modern standards, but functional in isolated, sea-bound communities where other infrastructure didn't exist. And always, nature was respected. Tools were not taken thoughtlessly. Leaves were plucked with thanks. Shells were collected with care. The act of cleansing was not a source of shame. It was as natural as breathing, as essential as fishing or gathering coconuts. Children were taught by example. Grandparents showed them which husks worked best, how to fold the leaf, how to toss the used bits back to the earth. There was no fear, no taboo, just quiet understanding. Even today, in some remote Pacific communities, these traditions endure, not out of poverty, but out of wisdom. Why waste money on imported paper when nature offers a perfect alternative? So as you lie there now, listening to your own world fade into silence, imagine the softness of tropical leaves, the fibrous texture of a sun-dried coconut husk, the gentle splash of seawater as someone rinses their hands beneath the reef. In these island worlds, wiping wasn't a problem to solve. It was a part of life, natural, rhythmic, and completely human. The scent of coal smoke fills the air now. Steam hisses, gears turn, and cities swell with the sound of clattering carriages and hurrying footsteps. We have entered the Industrial Revolution, a period of immense transformation, where factories bloom like iron flowers, and the world begins to move faster, louder, and more efficiently than ever before. Amidst these roaring changes, something very quiet also shifts: the way people wiped. For thousands of years, wiping had relied on the local, the natural, the handcrafted: leaves, wool, shells, stones, husks. But now, with the rise of mass production, a new player entered the scene, and slowly over time would become the gold standard: paper. But it didn't happen all at once. Let us begin in a modest home in 19th century London. It's damp, the fire crackles faintly in the hearth. A narrow alley leads to a wooden privy behind the house. Inside, beside the seat, there's no roll of tissue, but there is a stack of old newspapers, recycling in its earliest form. People tore pages from broadsheets, or periodicals, ads, political rants, bits of serialized fiction, and used them to wipe. Coarse, yes. Effective, often. Paper was plentiful, disposable, and relatively soft compared to leaves or husks. And best of all, it was free if you'd already read it. In the United States, rural families swore by the Sears Roebuck catalog, delivered to homes by post. It featured everything from boots to barns, and hundreds of pages perfect for the outhouse. It became so synonymous with wiping that in some homes people skipped reading it entirely and went straight to its second purpose. But not everyone had access to print. In poorer tenement districts, people still relied on rags, scraps of clothing that were used and reused until they fell apart. In some homes, a bucket of old cloth sat beside the toilet. After use, they'd be boiled, scrubbed, and laid out to dry. It was work, it was messy, but it was routine. And yet, even as people wiped with catalogues and cloths, a quiet revolution was stirring. In 1857, a man named Joseph Gaiety introduced the first commercial toilet paper in the United States. It came in individual sheets, not rolls. Each sheet bore his name, printed proudly in fine type, and was advertised as medicated and good for hemorrhoids. Made from pure manila hemp, it was soft by the standards of the time, but expensive. Most people didn't buy it. Why pay for paper when newspapers were free? Still, Gaiety planted a seed. A few decades later, in the 1870s, the Scott brothers took that seed and turned it into something much more familiar: toilet paper on a roll, perforated, easy to tear, and gradually more refined. The company marketed it to hotels, department stores, and railway stations, positioning it as a mark of modernity and class. But adoption was slow. At the time, even talking about toilet habits was taboo. Stores didn't want to display it. People didn't want to admit they used it. Meanwhile, others still clung to the old ways. Farmers in rural Europe continued to use hay, moss, and rags. Factory workers might use wood shavings or scrap packaging. And in tenement buildings, communal toilets served dozens of families, each with their own wiping preferences, often involving whatever they could find. But as cities expanded and indoor plumbing began to spread, the tide turned. Toilet paper, now produced more cheaply and in larger quantities, became the natural partner for the flush toilet, a marvel of sanitation that quickly replaced outhouses and chamber pots. The combination of water and paper was far more compatible than cloth or husks. And as the 20th century dawned, people's expectations changed. Wiping was no longer just about doing the job. It became about comfort, convenience, and eventually luxury. Manufacturers introduced softer tissue, scented rolls, and two-ply innovations. Ads emphasized softness, cleanliness, even glamour. What was once unspeakable became commercialized, with smiling housewives, fluffy puppies, and pastel-colored packaging. Toilet paper became a symbol of progress, of civilization, of modernity. But along the way, something else was lost: the deeply personal, ecological relationship people once had with their environment. No longer were leaves plucked carefully, or cloths washed by hand. Now rolls came wrapped in plastic, stacked in towers, and tossed away without a second thought. Still, for all its convenience, toilet paper is relatively new in the grand sweep of history. Most of humanity, for most of time, wiped with other things, some rough, some soft, some strange, but all drawn from the land around them. So as you lie back now, perhaps hearing the distant hum of pipes behind your walls, think of the world before perforated rolls and scented tissue, of the Sears catalogue fluttering in the wind, of Joseph Gaiety's signature on every sheet, of the quiet outhouses and city alleyways, where people did what people always do, and found a way. Because in the end, the story of wiping isn't just about hygiene, it's about ingenuity, adaptation, and the little things that make us human. And now, we rest. We've wandered through time, we've walked the stone roads of Rome, stepped into bamboo courtyards in China, crouched in Viking longhouses and Mongol plains. We've lifted coconut husks under island palms and sifted through ash in African villages. And always, in every time and place, people wiped. It's such a small act, so mundane, so private, yet it connects us across centuries, across continents, across languages and empires and belief systems. A simple human need met in thousands of different ways, with leaves, rags, wool, shells, pebbles, water, paper, and even snow. It is strange, isn't it, that something so universal, so essential, is so often left out of the history books. There are no great statues commemorating the sponge stick of Rome, no national museums showcasing the finest corn cobs of colonial America, no school lessons on mullein leaves or ash pots or paper catalogues turned practical, and yet these things mattered. Every civilization, every home, every ordinary life included them, because long before modern comforts, before plumbing, before factories could spin out rolls by the million, people found a way, always. They used what they had. They respected the earth, they passed their knowledge on. Mothers taught daughters how to fold a leaf. Grandfathers warned which bark not to touch. Children learned not just how to eat, build and play, but how to clean themselves, properly, gently, naturally. In those ancient and simple methods, there was wisdom, a closeness to nature, a humility in understanding that the body needs care, and that the earth, if treated well, will always provide. Today we live in a world where toilet paper comes in scented rolls, packaged in plastic, stacked in warehouse towers under fluorescent light. We flush and forget. We rarely wonder where it comes from, or what came before, but perhaps tonight, you've wondered. Perhaps tonight, lying there slowly drifting towards sleep, you've imagined yourself in a tiled Roman latrine, dipping a sponge into vinegar, or seated in a humble yurt, wiping with softened leather while snow falls quietly outside, or squatting beside a banana tree in a warm breeze, reaching for a leaf that generations before you also chose. And maybe, just maybe, you feel a little more connected to those people, not to emperors or conquerors or kings, but to the everyday humans who lived, breathed, and cleaned, just like you. Because history is not just battles and crowns, it's also baskets of moss. It's almanacs with torn-out pages, taro leaves folded in half, and stones chosen for their smoothness. It's in the quiet corners of life, the ones nobody writes down, the ones we all share, whether in a palace or a cottage or a tent by the river. So let yourself rest now. Let your thoughts drift to those small moments in distant lands, to hands that reached for leaves, for snow, for cloth, to mornings and evenings, centuries ago, that began and ended not so differently from ours. And tomorrow, when you reach for that soft white roll, maybe, just maybe, you'll do so with a little more gratitude, and a small sleepy smile, because wiping, as strange as it seems, is one of the oldest, quietest threads tying humanity together, from leaves to luxury. Good night.